Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the community meeting for February 13th at 5 p.m. Just before we get started, I just want to read some information about a lobbying notice. This is a notice to paid representatives. If you are compensated to monitor, attend, or speak at this meeting, city law may require you to register as a lobbyist and report your activity. See Los Angeles Municipal Code section 48.01 et sec. More information is available at ethics.lacity.org/lobbying. For assistance, please contact the Ethics Commission at 213-978-1960 or ethics.commission@lacity.org. And on the agenda tonight, we have the welcome and introduction from our general manager at the Consolidated Plan, discussion, local data, followed by more discussion and the public engagement and timeline.
Okay, I think that's my cue. Good afternoon or evening, everyone. It's great to be part of this conversation again with all of you. My name is Abigail Marquez, and I serve as the General Manager of the Community Investment for Families Department. And we're here today to solicit your input and your feedback as we hold one of many sessions that will help to inform our next 5-year plan, which is due to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development later this year. The team has prepared a PowerPoint presentation with all of you. We want your honest feedback. We want to identify where we have gaps in our ability to provide critical services to some of our most vulnerable residents across our city. We want to look at areas such as economic development and growth opportunities, supporting our local business community, our support services that we offer through our family source system and our domestic violence system that supports, again, low-income households across the city, survivors of intimate partner violence, and other gaps that you may be aware of with respect to the work that you do in your community day in and day out. We do find ourselves this year, it's in a year of transition. We have a new mayor that was sworn in last year in December. Our Mayor Karen Bass, has declared an emergency declaration with respect to homelessness. And this plan will be one potential resource that we can leverage to support the citywide priorities that have been outlined by the mayor with respect to ending homelessness. But we also want to make sure that we continue to support residents who are continuing to struggle with finding stable housing. Many residents are having a hard time maintaining their housing, paying either utility arrears and rental arrears, and with addressing food insecurity, many other critical services that we continue to respond to through our work. The team, again, has prepared a PowerPoint presentation. This is one of many sessions, and you may be part of other sessions that we will hold. All of these sessions will, again, help us to compile priorities, recommendations, very valuable input that we will then share with our policymakers. We share the list of recommendations that are directly, again, in many cases, direct quotes from all of you in terms of where you're seeing gaps in services. We will present those recommendations to the mayor and the city council. They will then do an analysis of those recommendations, and they will incorporate to a great extent the recommendations that you all bring forward in the next budget. The mayor will be releasing the budget, expected to release the budget in early April, the consolidated planning budget, and we are working towards the submission of our next 5-year plan to HUD in July of this year. So again, this is very valuable input that we are requesting your support and participation in. And this is not the only session. So there will be future opportunities for you to continue to provide input to the team, and we'll share the different mechanisms that we've outlined for you to provide that input via email or in future sessions that we also will be holding. So with that said, I'm going to turn it back to the team to walk us through the PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Virginia Flores, and I am with the National Development Council. I've been working with the team at the city to help put together their consolidated plan and organize these meetings and get feedback from the public. So the first thing we wanted to start off with was a quick poll to hear everybody, like, we're all here because we're invested in LA. We either live here, we work here, we go to school here, we own a business here, right? So there's lots of reasons that bring us to LA, and lots of reasons why people love LA. Aaron or Bernard, if you could launch this first poll. Right, there's a ton of things to do here. There's a reason why so many people want to live here and move here. And just wanted to get a little bit of your take on why, what brings you to LA? What do you love about it? Me personally, right? I grew up here, lived on the East Coast for a while, but moved back. Why? Because the weather is great, the food is great, there's everything nearby that you could possibly want to do if you like being outside. Right, so as we can see, weather is coming in pretty high as the top reason for people living here. Mountains, we're pretty close to the mountains. A couple people saying they love the beach as well, and also food, right? But it seems like the winner here is going to be the weather, right? Why do we live in LA? Why do we want to own business here? It's here, go to school here. It's because we love the weather most of the year, right? As you can see, I'm wearing a scarf today, but it's a little bit cold. But usually our winters are pretty mild, and we love being able to spend so much time outside and get so much sun during the year. So thank you for weighing in on that. It's a quick, fun way to gauge, why you're here and why you love LA, like we all do. Thanks, Bernard and Aaron. I think we can close the poll and then we'll go ahead and get started. So as Aaron walked through the agenda a little while earlier, right, we're going to lay out, what is this process we're here for today? Like, what is this consolidated plan that you're hearing about? It's a plan that's required by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, known as HUD. And it's designed to help states, cities, counties, right, figure out like what are the needs of the community, and what are the market conditions, right, that we should be taking into consideration when determining the use of large federal grants, right? And so the grants that we're talking about here are 4 different grants that the city is looking at. One is a Community Development Block Grant Program, known as CDBG. The next is Home Investment Partnerships Program, known as HOME. Emergency Solutions Grant Program, ESG, and the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, known as HOPWA, right? And I'll go through each of these different programs in the next couple slides and give you kind of like how much money, are we talking about, and what are these funds used for? This next plan that the city is putting together currently is going to cover the next 5-year period. So we're talking 2023 through 2027. So we also wanted to give you a little bit of idea of like, how do these funds come to the city, right? So as I mentioned, HUD, right, gets appropriations from Congress every year. They kind of set the overall budget for the federal funding across the board, right? Gives this money to HUD. HUD then, right, gives these money out to communities, as I said earlier, states, cities, counties, right? So the city gets a pot of money, right, in each of these buckets. The city, that money then goes into CIFD, right? It's one of the city departments that is charged with administering these funds, operating programs in line with the goals of these different funding pots, right? And that's like why we call it a consolidated plan, is because it's, instead of making plans for each of these 4 different pots of money, you're making one consolidated plan for the use of these 4 funding sources. And then, right, what are we doing with this money? How are we rolling it out across the city into different neighborhoods, into your communities? Right, this planning process helps us figure that out, right? So that it can go to make, impact in your communities. So just, wanted to give people idea of where this money all comes from and where it's intended to go. So the first pot of money that we're talking about here is the Community Development Block Grant Program, known as CDBG. It's a pretty large source of funding for cities and counties across the country. As you see here, the estimated allocation for this pot of money is $50 million this year. It's still an estimate. We're still waiting for final numbers from HUD, but this is, in the ballpark of what the city expects to receive this year. What is this money used for, right? It's supporting community development activities to build stronger and more resilient communities. And the target population for this is low and moderate income persons, right? So whatever we're funding with this pot of money should go to people that need financial assistance. So what are the kinds of eligible activities that we're talking about here? Things like housing preservation, right? Making upgrades to homes, public facilities like libraries, community centers, senior centers, those types of things, public services, economic development activities, supporting small businesses, right? So it's a probably the broadest pot of funding that we're talking about today. You'll see, right, some of these uses are housing, social services, economic development, right? So it's a more varied pot of money than the others that we'll be talking about today.
Virginia, I'm going to jump in here real quick and remind folks in Spanish, si necesitan traducción en español, que pueden oprimir el globo en la baja porción de su pantalla. En interpretation hay un globito. Hágale clic and there should be a selection for español. Si quieren interpretación, oprimen el globito y seleccione la opción por español. Gracias.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good reminder that we both have Spanish interpretation and ASL, right? So as Rebecca said, you can click on the little globe if you need any of the interpretation services. The next pot of money that we're talking about is the Home Investment Partnerships Program, known as HOME. The, again, estimated allocation for this as well is $37 million. This really, right, tells you, the name tells you what this money is for. It's supporting increased home ownership and increased numbers of affordable housing available to the public. And again, who is the target audience, right? The target audience is low and very low income persons. So what are the kinds of activities that can be funded with the home dollars? More specifically, right, to housing, rental assistance, right? If you don't have enough money to pay a market rent every month, then you need a little bit of subsidy, right? That's what we're talking about when we talk about rental assistance. Rehab, so repairs to homes, right, to make them suitable for living. Buying new sites to build more housing, doing the stuff that you need to do to prepare that site to be built on, right, constructing new housing. And then also it gets used a lot for home ownership assistance, right? So if there's down payment programs, right, that the city can fund for people that are would like to own a home but can't quite get there, right? How do we help increase home ownership opportunities across the city? The next pot of funding we're talking about is the housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, known as HOPWA. Estimated allocation for this year, $24 million. The name also tells you here, what it's focused on, providing housing and supportive services for people for low-income persons with HIV and AIDS and their families, right? So this also, the name tells us a lot, right? So it's going to cover things like rental assistance, as we talked about, right? Making sure people have enough money to pay market rents, case management, supportive services, right? Kind of these like wraparound services that someone would need to remain stably housed. Facility operation cost, again, acquisition for buying sites for construction, right? And again, repairing and constructing housing are all the kinds of like eligible activities that you would be able to fund with HOPWA. And the smallest pot of money that we're talking about today is the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, known as ESG. Right, this is expecting a little bit under $5 million for this. And this is specifically for people that are experiencing a housing crisis and to fund ways to get them quickly rehoused, right, to regain stability. So the things that that ESG can fund, right, are things like outreach on the street to people, right, meeting them where they are, emergency shelter services, homeless prevention services like case management type of stuff we were talking about earlier, rapid rehousing assistance, right? Getting people back into housing as quickly as possible. And then also this HMIS system is the Homeless Management Information System. It's a system that HUD uses nationwide to collect information on people that are experiencing homelessness. Like the city and the county use this to report up to HUD. So, you know, talked a little bit about eligible uses and the kinds of things that are usually funded with these dollars, but more specifically, right, what does the city fund with this money, with these 4 pots of money? So things like the family source centers, right, that are operated by CIFD, minor home repairs, as we talked about, first-time homebuyer loans, developing new affordable rental housing units, short and long-term rental assistance, right? So for brief periods of time and also for longer periods. A little bit of economic development activities, like we talked about, growth strategies for small businesses, right? Supporting the creation and continued operation of small businesses, and supportive services, and shelter for domestic violence survivors, right? So these are just some examples that we put up here. It's not a, you know, complete list of everything that the city funds, but we just wanted to give you more concrete examples of the kinds of things that could be funded with these dollars, right? But there's also many things this money can't fund, right? There's always, you know, when you think about the needs in your community, there's always a very long list of potential things, right, that you would like to see money invested for. But some of the things that we can't fund with this money are things like police, public transit, and schools, right? We know that these things are important, right? But they're, you know, as we walked through all of the eligible activities for these different funds, these are some of the things that, you know, these dollars can't fund. But as you see on the other side of the screen, right, there's quite a big list of things that we can fund with these dollars. So as I said earlier, right, we're looking at the next 5-year period, but we also wanted to give you a look back into the last 5-year period. So these priority needs were established the last time the city did a consolidated plan, so 2018 to 2023. And these were the things that the city, right, when it was doing this process, getting public input, talking to providers and community orgs, partners in the city. These are the priority needs that the city arrived at. The city needs to reduce and prevent homelessness, displacement, and housing crisis experiences by investing and increase access to safe, affordable, permanent housing, right? So one, very focused on housing. And the next one was provide opportunities for residents with low income to prosper by investing in the creation of living wage jobs, improvements for livable neighborhoods, and services that support self-sufficiency by increasing income, improving educational attainment, and improving health, right? So this is a kind of like broader goal for the kinds of improvements the city wanted to see for its low income residents, right? Gains in many different areas, not just related to housing and the quality of their neighborhood, but also broader, right? Health, education, income. So those are the 2 needs that the city identified in the last cycle. And these are the goals that it set forth, right? Taking into consideration those needs that it developed, right? These, you know, now that we've gone through this, like this language and these goals would make sense, right? So developing affordable housing, right? Knowing that there's such a need here, preserving existing affordable housing, right? Making sure that affordable rental units, affordable housing units, ownership units stay affordable, and then also don't go out of disrepair, right? So that they can continue being used by people who need those resources. Stabilizing and revitalizing neighborhoods, right? Making sure we're having safe, vital neighborhoods, preventing and reducing homelessness and domestic violence, right? Obviously, this is still a big topic in the city. Improving local economy for low-income residents, right? As we talked a little bit about earlier, like the focus of these funds is very often on low-income residents, and helping low-income families to stabilize economically, right? So not just improving the economy for low-income residents across the city, but also helping them stabilize, right, for longer periods of time so that they continue to have gains in the future. So now that we've kind of gone through, right, like what is the consolidated planning process? What is what are these different types of funding pots that we're talking about? What were some of the goals from the last go around in the last 5 years? We wanted to let you chime in, right? Like based on what you've heard so far, what are the things that you think need more investment in your community, right? And this list will look familiar since it's the one that we just went through with the city's goals from the last 5-year planning cycle. Do any of these resonate with you, right? And you can feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand here to hear from you, right? On what you've heard so far, thoughts, feedback, what's resonating, what still feels really, important from the last cycle. And then my colleague Andrea will kind of go through and at the second half of this presentation, a little bit like more forward-looking conversation, right, about additional items. But if anybody has any thoughts they want to share, what feels really important to you and what needs more investment in your community, please feel free to raise your hand and we can have a short break for discussion here. And I'll give a little time. So Diana, I see your hand is going up. So Diana, why don't you go ahead and let us know what's on your mind.
So for us here, but on it's between 54th Broadway and Grand, our issues are homelessness, right? Just like everywhere else in LA, mostly. The problem is that it's how do we track what is being allocated where? And are there any measurements towards these goals? Like, let's say we're going to, just for example, we're going to develop more affordable housing. What is affordable housing here in California? And who could actually pay $2,000 for rent? And how do we keep track of what's actually where these funds are going? Is there like any agendas, where we can find the numbers? Because at the end of the day, numbers don't lie, right? I can tell you that I am an investor and I'm gonna develop 25 homes, right? And I'm gonna tell you that they're gonna be affordable housing, but in those affordable housing, only 3 of those are actually gonna be affordable for our community. So how is that being tracked? That the money is going to certain places, but they're still not affordable.
Yeah, Diana, that's definitely a challenge, right? As you said, it's both keeping track of like the money that's coming in, right? And it's coming from so many different sources. And as here, we're talking about these 4 different funding streams from the federal government. But this is, as you know, like only 4 sources out of hundreds, right, of sources that are coming from the state, that are coming from the county, that are coming from the city, that are coming from other federal sources. So it's a challenge, right, to keep track of like the money that's both coming in and then the outcomes that are being produced, right? I think your question about like, what is that money actually creating? And I think that's your concerns are probably ones that are echoed across, many different people across the city and the country, right? Really is what are we getting in return for these public investments? But I'll also open it up to the city. I'm not sure if anybody from the city's team wants to respond. But yeah, it's a challenge. I know the city has made many efforts, right, at trying to do kind of like reporting for different funding streams and different initiatives. But as you see, right, these are just 4 sources that we're talking about, and it's a big hurdle, I think, for any community trying to do that kind of tracking that you're talking about. And Rebecca, I saw you unmute yourself.
Sure. Just a quick comment to add to that. I know our sister department, the LA Housing Department, does manage a tracker on their public facing website. And what that does is that provides really high level graphical information in terms of their progress towards creating affordable housing, with a highlight on those those larger amounts of funds that are city specific. So, with the HHH measure, it's
Mhm.
helping that they're keeping themselves accountable to how they're spending and the progress that they're making. I'll try to get that website and lock it in and drop it in the chat there. But that's a way for a person specifically, individually, to go in and then pretty currently check to see what the progress is. Specifically, Diana, to your question around affordable housing, with respect to how the community development block grant and even the other funding sources are doing on an annual basis, we are required by the federal government, by HUD, to produce what our performance has been through the Consolidated Annual Performance Report, the CAPER. And so that is something that we also try to post on our website and to provide access to. There's a bit of a lag with respect to that. We're always working on this current year. We're always looking to report the previous year's performance. I can also drop a link there so that you could see what our most current plan that has been approved by HUD looks like. So that's a way to also help yourself track how we're spending funds. Looking back, we also invite you to track the various actions at the local level in terms of what our elected officials are directing us to do with respect to the plan on an annual basis. We'll be going to council in the next couple of months. We're specifically assigned to the Economic and Community Development Committee. That's something that you want to subscribe to with the city clerk's office. And then sometime, a couple of months thereafter, we will go back to council and have them give the blessing to the plan. And there'll be a few more remarks made to that ahead in the presentation, but it is a lot of information, and the knowledge isn't how to access this information. So we'll do our best to give you those sort of shortcuts and links to get that information for yourself.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Working on the housing unit development. I'll put that link in the chat.
Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca and Angela. Lots of great specific resources, right, about how the city does reporting for a number of different funding streams and initiatives, right? And as Andrea mentioned in the chat, yes, as we go through the presentation, feel free to drop your questions and comments. And when we take these discussion breaks, right, we'll be able to answer any questions that you may have. But thank you for offering some thoughts, Diana, and then we'll move on to the rest of our presentation now. So I'll pass it off to Andrea, and then we'll have another little poll and then also a discussion break.
Okay, great. Thank you. And to your point, Diana, the question of affordability, we're going to present some data now of exactly what is affordability, what does it mean to be cost burdened by your housing. And so all of the data, well, most of the data that we're going to present here is from the U.S. Census Bureau. And we have those sources available if anyone is really into the data and wants to click through and see where we got these wonderful graphics. But the first thing we want to do is just talk about what are the social and economic characteristics, in the city of LA. The median household income is just under $70,000. And we have a few more stats here regarding, some of these housing units, right? So more than half of the housing units were built before 1970. Many people, almost 60% speak another language at home other than English. About 36% of households have a minimum of a bachelor's degree or higher, which is just a slight bit above the national average. The national average is around 30%. There's about 17% of people are living in poverty, and there's about 7% of persons with disabilities. And so what does this mean when we look at sort of the map of LA? The next slide here is showing you where the distribution of this median family income is. And again, this is data for 2016 through 2020. The darker shaded areas in this map represent higher income levels. And, as you probably wouldn't be surprised by, these are, concentrated closer to the coast, sort of in the northern hills area of LA. And the lighter colors, the lightest color there is 42,000 or less.
in median family income. And so this is just a visual to see what that striation looks like around the city and where there are these sort of concentrations of wealth, and then where are sort of pockets of more lower income. And this is important because of all the programs we're discussing today, most of them are to benefit lower moderate income persons. And that is calculated on 80% of the median family income. And so when we look at what does it mean to be cost burdened and what is an affordable rent, typically cost burdened households are paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs, including rent, mortgage, and utilities. And so when we look at some of the data, again, coming from the Census Bureau in LA, nobody would be surprised that more than 60% of folks are renting. And of those 60% of renter-occupied units, about 60% of those are considered to be cost-burdened renters, which means they're spending more than that 30% of their income on housing costs. Owner-occupied units are just under 40%, and about half of those folks are considered to be cost-burdened. And then one more stat here, households that are severely cost burdened, which is defined as paying over 50% of your income on housing, is just under 20%. So this is a big issue and why a lot of the funds are going to be focused on affordable housing. So in the next slide, we're going to look at breaking that down. How do you actually calculate what is affordable, right? To Diana's earlier question, how do we define that for somebody? Using the median family income, of just under 70,000, 30% of that would be about 21,000. And so if you divide 21,000 by 12, you're going to get a maximum monthly rental payment of about $1,744. And this household budget that you see here on the left-hand side of the screen is an example of a breakdown of what a budget could be, right? 30% on housing, about 20% on transportation and groceries, 20% on savings and retirement, and about 30% sort of, discretionary. And so as we look at some examples of some annual wages and what those affordable housing payments would be, it becomes very obvious very quickly, how unaffordable some rents may be in the LA area. For a computer programmer, for example, annual wage is just over 100,000. Somebody with this type of wage could potentially afford about 2,600 in rent, which sounds pretty good, right? That's maybe not as out of the box. But as you look down to a lower wage employee, like a waiter or a waitress, or perhaps a nursing assistant, these are folks that are making, less than 40,000 annually. Their affordable housing payment would calculate to, between $900 and $950 a month. And so I don't know the last time I saw rent that was that affordable in LA, but this is what we're talking about, is addressing this affordability and what people should be able to afford without being cost burdened, and creating more of that housing. And then another good stat that we wanted to present here are the small business statistics. So one thing that might be surprising to folks is that a small business is defined by the SBA as having fewer than 500 employees, which is actually quite large, right? That's a really large company. There are further definitions of micro business, right, which are typically 5 employees or less, or self-employed individuals. But according to the U.S. Census Bureau, more than 325,000 small businesses are located in the LA metro area. And about half of those, those small businesses are employing more than half of the workers, right? 2.8 million out of 5.4 million workers are employed by small businesses. So these small businesses are really a big center of employment, right? Creation and retention of jobs is typically what the focus is for small business, and using some of these funds for economic development purposes, because they are a huge part of the economy. And so next, we're going to talk a little bit about some homelessness stats here. So I'm sure not a lot of people are surprised by hearing this stat, but just under 42,000 people experience homelessness on any given night in the city of Los Angeles. That is about a 2% increase from 2020. Again, probably not surprising is to learn that, there's been a 32% increase in homelessness over the last, 2 to 3 years from 2018 to 2020. These numbers have just kind of exploded. However, there has been a ton that has been a lot of focus and a lot that has been done. The city, in partnership with the county, has housed over 86,000 people in the same about 3 to 4 year period. So they're housing lots of people, but the number of sheltered persons has increased by 55%. But I think what's important here is that while there is some progress being made on the problem, the rate of increase of homelessness is faster than the folks that are being sheltered. But we do have some very current data too from the 2022 point in time count. From February, the city has created 300 new interim housing beds and opened close to 500 new units as well, with another 1,900 expected to come online by the end of 2023. So while the stats are a little alarming, there is a lot that is being done to address it. And a little bit more about the homelessness population, the characteristics, right, of this population. Again, some of this is probably not too surprising. People of color make up about 80% of the homeless population, domestic violence victims 42%, and folks with serious mental disability 25%. And so this is where we're talking about wraparound services and equity and trying to address, the inequities that are facing people of low income, persons of color. They're disproportionately affected by homelessness, especially in the city of LA. And so again, we have another little map here to help you sort of visualize it, right? We're throwing out a lot of stats, but we want to try to help you visualize what does this actually mean. And this map is showing you homelessness by council district. And the red zones are showing where the actual the percent change in homelessness has increased, right? So council district 9, 3, there's a couple here that you can see that have increased the total percentage of homeless population in those districts, where some of these green ones you can see, like District 11 had like almost a 40% drop in homelessness population in that area. So again, this is to help us visualize which areas of the city, which districts are being disproportionately affected by homelessness, and coupling that with the low income population to help us know where to prioritize and direct these funds. And again, that leads us to a little bit more specific information on the mayor's declaration of emergency. So there was a state of emergency on homelessness declared December 12th, 2022, with a 6-month declaration that gives the city the power to sort of accelerate and streamline its response to this homelessness crisis. These include all of the things that we're talking about here that are being funded through some of these HUD programs, including building, renting, acquiring temporary permanent housing. And then again, there was an executive order made on December 21st, made by the mayor to coordinate a citywide strategy, right, to move people who are experiencing homelessness into interim and permanent housing. And then about a month later, January 18th, 2023, just last month, the city council established a homelessness emergency account by repurposing about $50 million in city funds to help immediately pay for hotels, increasing staffing and providers who are conducting the outreach to the homeless population. So not only is this a focus of the funding that comes down from HUD, and there's always been a focus on that. Additionally, in the city of LA, this declaration of emergency by the mayor is going to be very highlighted in the consolidated plan for the next 5 years to try to really attack this problem to the best of the ability. So we have another little pause here to get some feedback from you. We're going to do a little poll right now, and then afterwards we have a few discussion questions. But we're curious, what was most surprising to you with some of this data that has just been presented? Was it the median income level? 70K is actually pretty high, I'd say, nationwide. Or perhaps it was the percentage of people that are cost burdened, this homelessness count as well. The number of people, 42,000 people is quite a few. Yeah, so we're just curious to see, what stood out to you in some of the data. Because again, the plan is very data informed. We are gathering data, we present data, we get community participation and input like today, and then we make new priorities based on all of those things sort of combined. Yeah, and it looks like median income was, maybe one of the more surprising things. But I think everybody clicked at least one of them, right? So I think all of these things were a bit surprising to folks when you actually put the data and the numbers to it, which is, again, part of the point of this is to give you that data and kind of frame the discussion so that you have a deeper understanding of what it is that we're talking about. Okay, and so the discussion questions, again, we welcome you to come off mute, to type your questions in the chat. I did see that a couple of the links from the other questions are there. But here's some prompts for some discussions. What do you feel are the most urgent needs in your community? Increasing housing and economic instability are major concerns in LA. How is this issue affecting the community you live in? Which program have you seen to be the most effective in supporting the needs of low-income communities? As we sort of went through and defined what that is now, which public facilities and improvements would you like to see most in your neighborhood? And another just prompt here is, what areas of LA should be prioritized for more investment? So I'll pause, and again, I welcome you to unmute or raise your hand. I know it's a lot of data to sort of take in and formulate questions. We are going to post the contact information too at the end. So if you think of something or some of this starts to resonate later and you want to, post a comment or a question in the future, you don't have to answer now if you're not ready. But we'd love to hear anything.
One participant did say they would love to see more beautification projects.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Trying to reactivate some public space to make it more welcoming. Another thing I know, like increasing foot traffic does help to reduce, some blight in areas, and that is CDBG funds can be used to address blight in some cases. That was a good comment.
Tammy, it looks like you have a comment, so go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I actually just have a comment in terms of the data on number 2, the housing and economic instability. Do you have the data that it breaks it down? For example, I live in Highland Park, so there has been a shift in the housing and economic instability or stability for some in that area. So are there pockets, for example, in different communities, like where I work in Sereno or where I live in Highland Park? And do you have that breakdown, or you just have it as a congregate of a council district?
That's a good question. I feel like perhaps that map that we showed that kind of breaks down the median family income, that could probably be overlaid with some of the housing data, right? Because I think what some of the cost burden slides were trying to highlight is that, the market rate rent in the city is probably similar across, areas. Whereas when your income is fluctuating up and down, or when you're on the lower end of that income sort of scale, that market rate rent becomes that much more unaffordable for you and that much more, cost burdensome to you. So that could be one visual or one stat that we could kind of drill down a little bit more. But I think that's really what it is kind of where the concentration of low income, household incomes are, and looking at how the housing there, what the housing is doing there. Is it, still just as high as everywhere else? Is it a little bit lower? What are some of those factors that really affect that localized, sort of area?
And Tammy, just one note is that we pulled that area median income map from a site called Policy Map, which is a publicly available mapping site that you can, right, as Andrea said, you could layer the income information with like a cost burden or housing affordability layer on Policy Map. And right, we just did it for the city of LA. So kind of the way that we saw the different shading in the city of LA, you'd probably be able to see something like that, like the cost burden mapped out on the city. And it is something we're going to be looking at for the consolidated plan. But that's just a good resource for anybody who's interested in more of the data, is that Policy Map site, which is free, available to the public. You can just go in there and type in what area you're interested in and what kind of, if you're looking at like housing affordability, you can type that in. It kind of prompts you to here are some different census tables that looks at this data. So just a good resource for anyone to have.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment.
So it looks like, Diana, we have one more comment. Diana, was that your hand going up?
Yes.
Okay.
So what do you mean when, for number 5, where it says what areas of Los Angeles should be prioritized for more investment? Do you, is that question in regards to housing? Or what do you, what is it referring to? Is it just a general question as far as recreational housing? And for families, since most of the grants, for what I've seen, is for low income families, would this also include childcare? Because as we know, most low income families work 1 to 2 jobs a day. Therefore, for them to be able to take their child to school or after school program for childcare, would this include that as well or no?
Yeah, so when we're talking about investment, the priorities, we are specifically talking about the HUD dollars for the consolidated plan, right? So anything that could be funded under CDBG, home, or ESG. But I think your point is well taken about childcare. Childcare facilities are eligible for funding under CDBG, and there has been some programs that have been designed specifically for that. But I think, yeah, when we're kind of just getting feedback is, we do want to hear from folks in their sort of localized area, like, what do you see that could be funded? We gave you some lists of things that can be funded with these dollars, and, kind of what do you think the priorities should be and in what area? I think everybody would probably say, in my area where I live, that's where we should put more money.
Yeah, I mean, because even, it's South LA, right, for example.
Yeah.
And it's, if you just go based on zip codes, 90011, 90001, it's low to moderate income based on the census tract.
Mm-hmm.
You see that there's probably 11 people living in a home to be able to afford it, but then also there's not enough parking. So it's a constant issue. And I know that there's a lot of development going around when it comes to, they're doing like the fourplex, right? But then they're doing fourplex and there's not enough parking. We're already struggling with parking as it is. So what can be done to facilitate parking issues as well? Because though we are saying housing is an issue, what about the people that are parking and living in their cars? So for them to move and to give those other people that are coming in to these fourplexes an opportunity to be able to park close to their home, it's a big issue. And I've seen it quite a bit. I mean, there's people walking 4 blocks, 5 blocks with their children. They can't even walk on the sidewalk because there's encampment. So they're in the middle of the street to get to where they live.
Yeah, no, that's a really well taken point. I think that's one of the biggest challenges with affordable housing is oftentimes the parking, right? Because a lot of cities and counties make certain concessions for parking in order to increase the density, right? Like average unit density program allows you to build more dense housing and have less parking spots so that you can get more units into your project. And so that I think is like, but again, then it's like this disconnect, right? And so a lot of times what they do for those projects is it needs to be on a transit line, or they're going to encourage people to be taking public transportation instead of all like having, 2 cars per unit. Just 1.5 cars per unit is the parking garage they'll make. But again, it's one of these trade-offs. They want to be able to get as many affordable units into a new development. And you have to sacrifice sometimes some square footage for the parking in order to get that. So, but I do hear what you're saying. It's definitely like it's a trade-off. And I think that it's a good point though and I think that is a lot of complaints, that I sometimes hear about these density projects, is that it creates a parking nightmare because they're giving the concessions on the parking and for the development in order for it to get built, for it to happen. So that's a good point, and how to better balance that, right? What can be done.
I think also just to add to that, that's a really good response. Thank you. I think you're pointing to a situation that's very layered and complicated too, because you're talking about parking access that's hindered by developing more affordable units, but you also talked about the folks that are using the parking spots because they're living in their vehicles because they have nowhere else to live. And that's a sort of additional complication or layer. So we want to address what's happening with folks that are forced to be living in their vehicle, forced to take up that parking spot for an extended period of time because they don't have access to a roof over their heads. These comments are exactly what we need to continue to communicate to our mayor's office. That emergency declaration, from what I understand, is exactly to address those folks that need to come off the street, that need to come off an encampment, etc. So that comment that you had speaks to a lot of different needs that are elevated with this conversation. So we'll definitely take that back and kind of tease apart the various concerns that you addressed with that situation specifically, Diana. So thank you for that.
I have another comment that kind of touches on that. But one participant said that they would like to see more year-round shelters, and that people need help year-round until they're able to get into more stable housing. They also believe that they don't have much support for families with children. She says she knows of a woman who spent her nights riding the buses with her son and daughter because her son was 13 and would not be allowed with the women at the same shelter. So.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. As Rebecca said, right, these are the kinds of things that we want to be hearing from you, right? Raising different intersecting issues too, right? The impact that some issues have on others. Definitely like an important feedback for everyone to hear on this call. And as Andrea said, right, if you have additional comments, we're going to put up some emails at the end. You can also continue to drop some comments in the chat, like we'll keep that as a record. of concerns and comments that were raised during this call. And thank you, Andrea. We're gonna do a couple more slides and then we're gonna have a closing. So as we talked about the 5 years, right, the plan in the last 5 years, the city also wanted to share, right, potential focus that they're thinking about for the next 5 years, right? So we've heard a lot during this call, both from you and from the presentation, about poverty reduction and equity, and you probably, it's a big buzzword currently, and also this emergency declaration, right, from the mayor's office, right? We know that the pandemic has had a greater negative impact on low-income communities and communities of color, right? What do we do about that? It's creating more instability, as we said, economic instability for lots of families across the city. And so the mayor's declaration, right, is intended to focus the city and the city's resources, the city departments, right? How are we going to use our existing funding in more effective ways, right? To get people that are currently on the street, like, into more stable housing situations, either interim or more permanent housing situations, right? So as Andrea said too, right, like this is something we're considering for the consolidated plan, right? This is obviously a big focus for the city, but really looking at this, right? The pandemic, its impact, the rise in homelessness, increased housing and economic instability, right? How can we, as this language is like, marshal these funds, right? Align these funds, use these funds to target some of these issues. A little bit about the public engagement process that we've been going through. As we get feedback for the consolidated plan, right, we're hosting community meetings like these. This is our first large community meeting. We'll be having another one on Wednesday. If you know of other people that wanted to attend but couldn't today, please encourage them to register. There's a link in the chat, right, where you can find more information on the city's website, both for the survey and for registering for these meetings. The survey, right, is another way that we're getting your feedback, getting your opinion, right, on the different topics we've talked about, the different kinds of funding uses that we talked about. We want you to rank them and rate them and tell us what's most important in your community, right? And in terms of the data front, like we're asking for your zip code so we can kind of map, like what is more important in different parts of the city, right? So again, like, please take the survey, encourage your family and friends that live in the city, work in the city, own businesses here, have a stake in the city. Please encourage them to take the survey. We've also been having focus groups with city partners and community groups to get their take, right? They're some of the service providers, how is it hard to use these funds? What are some opportunities that we can take advantage of? Are there any gaps in what the service, network already provides? Are there any gaps that the city, isn't addressing that we could potentially, allocate resources to? So we've had a couple of focus groups and we'll be continuing to have them. And there's going to be one more community meeting when we post a draft public plan, right? Once we're done getting all this feedback from everybody and putting together a public plan, we're going to have another additional community meeting to let you know, right, what we heard from you. What is the city planning on doing? What do we think the priority needs are and the goals are for the next 5-year cycle? And getting your feedback at that point, right? That's part of the process, and we want to hear from you again about what did we go down the right path, or are there some things we could still change right before submitting a final version of the plan? And this is, again, just a quick timeline, right? The survey is open, as we mentioned. We're having these community meetings, continue to have the focus groups through February. We plan to have a draft consolidated plan for public comment in early April, right? And then have that community meeting we talked about to get your additional input and feedback on it in April. And then it will go before the City Council in May, and then submitting the final version with any revisions to HUD in June, right? So that's just a quick snapshot of the timeline we have. But on behalf of NDC, thank you for participating today and attending, and I'll turn it back over to the city for some closing comments.
Thank you. I'd like to thank NDC and the Consolidated Plan for putting together this presentation. But most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for taking time this evening to share your invaluable feedback. As we mentioned, the feedback you provided will be shared with our elected officials and used to help us decide how to use our public resources to help the communities that you live in for the next 5 years. So again, if after this meeting you think of something else you would like to share, please email us. I think the information is on the screen. And we also invite you to stay connected with us on social media at CIFDLA. And again, just thank you so much for taking time this evening to share your feedback with us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a quick question.
Yes.
You said that you had focus groups that you were connecting with different organizations at different times. And I just wanted to ask if you had engaged with an organization called Chrysalis.
We haven't as of yet, but we are familiar with them. And I think when we do, we're putting together the list. We're going to have a focus group specifically on the mayor's declaration. So I think, right, like they would be an organization that would definitely be like, you know, up for consideration and one of those for inviting to attend that focus group, since they work in that space. But thank you for raising that.
Yeah, I think that would be a great partner for you. I used to work with them, for them. I worked for them for about 10 years in the downtown office and in the San Fernando Valley office.
Mm-hmm.
And I retired about almost a year ago, but I'm still very connected with them. And you know, we would see clients, and the clients, this is where the story comes from of the lady riding the bus, because we were trying to connect her to housing.
Mm-hmm.
And she said to me, I can't do that, you know, because my son would be in danger. And she explained the situation to me. So there are very, very specific needs that we see in people who are trying to find work, trying to put their lives together, and, you know, the kind of support that they need. Not necessarily somebody who needs wraparound services, but just somebody who's fallen on hard times, and what is it they need to pick themselves up and to be self-sufficient. You know, and I think that Chrysalis is very, very much in touch with that kind of need.
Yeah, thank you for raising them. And I'm sure that we're working together with the city team to put together that list so thank you for flagging them. I do think they would be a great participant in that focus group.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
You can send any emails of people that you think would be interested in joining our focus group to cifd.planning@lacity.org. Thank you for that.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.
I think that concludes our meeting. We can feel free to go ahead and shut it down at this point. Thank you, Ms. Gamboa, for that last minute comment. That was appreciated. But that concludes our formal presentation. Thank you once again, and everybody have a good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you to our interpreters. We appreciate all your help this evening.
Very
Yes,
much
thank
so.
you.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night and happy Valentine's Day.
You too.